welcome to another deep dive into the Delta Conveyance Project. The Sacramento-San Joaquin Delta is one of the largest estuaries in North America, and it's home to around 500 plant and animal species, including about 50 species of fish. About 2/3 of California's salmon pass through the Delta on their way upstream to spawn. And Delta waters are also home to the endangered Delta smelt, which is widely seen as an indicator species for the overall health of the Delta's ecosystem. So naturally, questions about how the Delta Conveyance Project would take into account the needs of the fish in the Delta are often uppermost in people's minds. So here to explain the fascinating and complex subject of aquatic life in the Delta are two of the project's leading experts on Delta fisheries, Gardner Jones and Chris Geach. Gardner is a program manager in the Delta Conveyance Office and is responsible for the Delta Conveyance Fisheries analysis, as well as Endangered Species Act compliance. He's worked exclusively on Delta fisheries and related planning since joining DWR in 2006. Chris is a senior environmental scientist in the Division of Integrated Science and Engineering at DWR, working on the development of the Delta Conveyance Project and associated environmental compliance and permitting efforts. He has worked exclusively on Delta environmental planning since joining DWR in 2013. So welcome to you both.
Great to be here.
Okay, so Gardner, start us off, if you will, with some basic information about Delta fisheries. First off, what is really meant by the term fishery?
Good question, Pat. So generally a fishery is defined as a species of fish that is harvested either commercially or for sport. There are native and introduced fish species that sport in Delta fisheries, such as white sturgeon and striped bass, as well as commercial ocean fisheries like Chinook salmon. Although the Delta smelt doesn't currently support a viable fishery, it's important because it's an endemic fish, which means it only exists in this Delta. And as you mentioned, it's considered an indicator of overall Delta ecosystem conditions.
And Chris, could you give us a brief overview of the Delta environment as it pertains to fisheries?
Sure, Pat. So the Delta consists of three major landscapes and geographic regions. The first, the North Delta freshwater flood basins composed of freshwater inflow from the Sacramento River system. The second, the South Delta distributary channels composed of San Joaquin River flow. And lastly, the Central Delta tidal islands landscape, where in the Sacramento, San Joaquin, and East Side tributary flows converge and tidal influences from the San Francisco Bay are greater. Although the Delta is tidally influenced, most of the Delta does contain freshwater year-round due to inflows from rivers and reservoir releases. In addition, the tidally influenced low salinity zone can move upstream into the Central Delta. Salinity is a critical factor influencing the distribution of plant and animal communities in the Delta. So as Gardner mentioned earlier, the Delta is home to both native and non-native species. Because of the large reduction of hydrologic variability and landscape complexity, as well as other factors over the past 150 years or so, the Delta appears to have undergone an ecological regime shift, including lower abundance of native species, such as Delta smelt and longfin smelt, with a higher abundance of non-native, often sport fishing species such as largemouth bass, bluegill, and many more.
So Gardner, when it comes to the health of these species, what are the main factors that come into play?
Good question, Pat. So broadly speaking, the quantity and quality of aquatic habitat are the major factors that drive the Delta ecosystem. Physical and biological components set the stage for the Delta ecosystem and collectively determine the number and type of fish species, as well as their productivity. The volume and timing of water flowing into and through the Delta is a major driver and can play a role in the type, extent of available habitat. So for example, access to high quality floodplain habitat or the position of the low salinity zone. Other factors also can play a key role in individual fisheries as well as overall fish community health, including competition for resources with introduced species, degraded water quality due to pollutants, increasing water temperatures, availability and diversity of physical habitats, and changes to the food web.
Well, it's obviously a very complex system with a lot of different factors in play, including human influence, of course. So historically, what have been the major challenges to the health of the Delta fisheries, Chris?
Yeah, so historic changes to the Delta, as well as ongoing modifications, have altered the fish community and the productivity of the ecosystem. So for example, channelization of rivers, loss and reduced access to wetlands and other productive environments, and introduction of non-native species has reduced the capacity of the Delta to sustain native fish. In addition, water management practices for human needs, for example, storage, movement, and diversion of water, can alter the timing and amount of water flowing into and through the Delta, potentially modifying the extent and quality of various habitats.
And what other challenges are Delta fisheries facing today?
Yeah, so many of the stressors previously mentioned can individually and collectively affect the productivity of Delta fisheries. For example, the growing extent of invasive aquatic plants like Brazilian waterweed has physically modified the aquatic environment, degrading it from the perspective of pelagic fish like Delta smelt and providing benefits to other invasive species like largemouth bass, which may in turn prey on Delta smelt and juvenile Chinook salmon. There's also a growing amount of evidence that the Delta has undergone or is currently experiencing a regime shift, which essentially means that the Delta has experienced so many modifications that the native biological community, which has evolved in the region, has been substantially replaced. The extent of these modifications poses a significant challenge in managing the trajectory of the Delta ecosystem moving forward.
Now, I think many of our viewers today will be aware that it's because of all these environmental concerns that the quantity and quality of water in the Delta is highly regulated. Gardner, could you briefly explain the existing Delta operations criteria?
Sure, Pat. At least at kind of a high level, the way I think of it is that there are really numerous layers of existing Delta regulations that control water operations, including those established by the State Water Resources Control Board through Decision 1641 or D1641. And also there's regulations associated with activities permitted through federal and state fish agencies to regulate state water project diversions. So notable existing Delta regulations include, but aren't limited to, the allowable exports by the state and federal water projects. That's based on Delta inflows, which is governed, as I said, by D1641, the export to inflow ratio in particular. There are also Delta outflow requirements to manage salinity. Additionally, there are existing flow requirements like for old and middle rivers, and export restrictions based on state and federal Endangered Species Act permits, as I mentioned. These are intended to minimize potential impacts on listed fish species, so like Delta smelt, winter run Chinook salmon, and others, associated with the Central Valley and State Water Project South Delta water operations.
Thanks. Okay, so now let's move on to how the Delta Conveyance project would fit into or change the current system. And let's start with a key feature that we've heard a lot about in previous episodes, and that's dual conveyance. Can you remind us, Chris, what that actually means and explain why it's such a crucial feature of the project?
Yeah, absolutely. So dual conveyance simply means that we have a choice of where we divert water. So either from the current South Delta facilities or the new North Delta diversion facilities proposed under the Delta Conveyance project. This is very useful because it gives us flexibility, especially during high Sacramento River flows, such as during large storm pulses, where we could divert water at the new intakes with no or minimal effects to the aquatic environment. This would reduce or avoid South Delta intake and entrainment potential to fish, for example, like Delta smelt, occurring in the central and southern Delta, which can be concerned during these flow conditions. Alternatively, during periods where flows are less or vulnerable fish are more concentrated near the North Delta facilities, existing South Delta facilities would be relied upon. Overall, through intelligent investment in state water project facilities, New state-of-the-art water intakes in the North Delta would improve the ability to divert water while reducing potential rerouting, concentration, and handling of fish, as well as exposure to increased levels of predation that can occur at the existing South Delta facilities. The proposed screen technology, as well as operating criteria, will further avoid and minimize potential effects diverting water on the Delta fish community.
Very interesting. And so what would this actually look like in real practical terms, Gardner? How would it change the operations criteria?
Good question, Pat. Delta Conveyance project proposes new North Delta diversions, or NDDs, with state-of-the-art intake technology, as well as rules for operations that we call operating criteria. Conceptually, these rules are designed with layers of restrictions to minimize potential impacts to fish and the aquatic ecosystem. So while the proposed NDD intakes might have a capacity of 6,000 cubic feet per second, the operating rules would limit actual diversions based on factors like hydrologic conditions and fish presence. These layers of operating criteria are informed by a growing understanding of fish biology and behavior, as well as the Delta ecosystem as a whole. They're also intended to function at different geographic scales. At the overall Delta scale, the project is designed to integrate with existing facilities and operational regulations, like those noted earlier, say for outflows. At the scale of the lower Sacramento River and intake reach, we have developed a number of operating rules to minimize potential impacts, including bypass flow criteria. So bypass flow criteria are the main rules governing NDD operations. They set restrictions on the amount of Sacramento River flow that can be diverted at the NDD. Flow remaining in the river, bypassing the diversions, are intended to protect survival of fish like Chinook salmon and Delta smelt that migrate through the intake reach and through the Delta. These rules vary depending on time of year and hydrologic conditions. To help show some of the key considerations associated with these criteria, we'll use this figure of the Delta. Inflows identified here as Freeport flow with the red star be measured above the proposed NDD intake reach, which is shown here in light purple. Sacramento River flow downstream of the intakes, shown here with a green star, represents the bypass flows, the flow required to remain in the river. Sacramento River downstream of Georgiana Slough, shown here with an orange star, is also an important location in managing for tidal reverse flows. And that's times when tidal energy overpowers the river and water can flow upstream during a high tide. There's also criteria called pulse protection, which is intended to further reduce diversions down to low-level pumping during key winter flow pulses when larger concentrations of migrating winter run Chinook salmon juveniles have historically been shown to move down the Sacramento River. Low-level pumping is the lowest identified diversion level, with a maximum diversion rate of 0 to 6% of Sacramento River flow. It is intended to reduce operations such that they have no or potentially only minimal effects. Finally, at the near field scale, in addition to the intake screens themselves, we have fish screen approach and sweeping velocity criteria. These are requirements on how fast diverted water can move into and past the fish screens, respectively. They're designed to further minimize impacts like entrainment and impingement to vulnerable fish like Delta smelt at the screens themselves.
Thanks. So you just mentioned the fish screens, and I understand that the design and placement of the screens are critical considerations. Although the technology of fish screens is a topic for a whole other deep dive video, can you just very briefly describe how they work and how they are designed to minimize the risk of harming fish?
Sure, Pat. The fish screens are essentially a physical barrier to exclude fish when water is being diverted through an intake. The size and design of fish screens, like the cylindrical T-screens proposed for the Delta Conveyance project, are engineered to physically prevent the entrainment of all but the smallest fish eggs and larvae during operation. There are also operating criteria as developed by state and federal fish and wildlife regulatory agencies that restrict the rate of or velocity of water diversions in places and times when vulnerable fish species are present. The approach and sweeping velocity criteria that I mentioned earlier follow these regulations. Ultimately, these design and operating criteria have been tested and applied in the Delta and throughout the world and form the foundation for the technology and operations proposed for the Delta Conveyance intakes.
So interesting and such important work. Gardner and Chris, thank you so much for taking the time to talk with us today and for giving us some insight into your work on the project on behalf of the aquatic ecosystem of the Delta. And thanks as always to our viewers for watching. We hope that you found this deep dive informative and that you'll join us again next time for another Delta Conveyance deep dive.